Ladies and gentlemen, what we are witnessing today is not just another dip in the market, not just another economic adjustment. As the pundits like to call it, this is the unraveling of a 2.8 trillion industry that once stood as a pillar of modern capitalism. The global car market, once a symbol of industrial might and middle-class aspiration, is imploding before our eyes. And the question is not simply why after, but who benefits from the wreckage that's now unfolding. Because behind every so-called market crash, there are architects, profiteers, and silent victims, the working people who built the very machines now rusting in unsold lots. For decades, the car industry was the engine of economic dreams. From Detroit to Tokyo, from Stuttgart to Shanghai, it promised growth, jobs, and the illusion of mobility, both personal and social. But this latest collapse reveals the hard truth. The car market was not sustained by genuine demand or innovation, but by an inflated structure of debt, speculation, and corporate manipulation. Auto loans ballooned far beyond people's ability to pay. Cars were no longer a necessity. They became a financial product, bundled, traded, and securitized exactly as housing loans were before the 2008 crash. What we are seeing today is the bursting of that bubble. Dealerships are drowning in unsold inventory. Used car prices, once absurdly high, are plummeting. Consumers, crushed under rising interest rates and stagnant wages, can no longer afford the vehicles they were told were essential to their way of life. Banks, automakers, and financiers built a tower of profit on the backs of these consumers, and now that tower is crumbling. Yet, notice how the executives cash out their stock options before the collapse, while workers face layoffs and families face repossessions. This isn't an accident. This is systemic design. The corporate elite squeezed maximum profit during the pandemic-driven demand surge. After hiking prices under the banner of supply shortages, when the working class began to default, when inflation eroded their paychecks, when the illusion could no longer be sustained, they pulled the plug and blamed market forces. But the market, my friends, is not a natural law. It's a man-made construct built to serve those at the top. We're told this collapse is about overproduction. But think about what that really means. Millions of cars sitting idle while millions of people can't afford transportation. It's not a production problem. It's a distribution problem. Capitalism's logic demands that profit comes before need. Factories shut down not because the world has enough cars but because the companies cannot sell them at a profit. That is the absurdity of this system. Abundance leads to crisis. Productivity leads to collapse and workers are told to tighten their belts while CEOs prepare their next bailout. Governments are stepping in, of course, but not to rescue you. They're rescuing the industry the same way they rescued banks, oil companies, and hedge funds. The same playbook: socialize the losses, privatize the gains. They'll say they're stabilizing markets, but what they're really doing is stabilizing inequality. The truth is, the working class never recovered from the last crash. They just went deeper into debt to maintain the illusion of stability. And now, the collapse of the car market will be used to justify even more austerity, layoffs, and cuts, all while executives plead for subsidies and call themselves too important to fail. This crisis exposes a deeper sickness, not of cars, but of capitalism itself. When production is driven not by human need, but by private profit, collapse is not a mistake. It is inevitable. Each boom lays the foundation for the next bust. Each record year for corporations is another countdown to disaster for workers. The car market's crash is not a separate event. It's part of the same systemic rot that's been spreading through housing, healthcare, and energy. The collapse of the 2.8 trillion car market was not an unpredictable catastrophe or a sudden act of economic misfortune. It was the logical outcome of a system built to fail. After. When you construct an economy around profit rather than purpose, speculation rather than stability, and exploitation rather than equity, after. Collapse is not a possibility. It is an inevitability. What we are witnessing today is not an accident of poor policy or unforeseen shocks. It is the unraveling of decades of deliberate design, a system that fed on itself until it could no longer sustain the illusion of endless growth. After the car market was inflated not by genuine demand, but by a financialized version of capitalism that turned automobiles into debt instruments. For years after, easy credit disguised the deepening inequality within society. People were no longer buying cars because they could afford them, but because they were offered loans structured to appear manageable until they weren't. The illusion of prosperity was maintained through financing plans that stretched over 7 or even 8 years, trapping consumers in a cycle of perpetual payment. Banks and automakers celebrated record sales, but what they were really celebrating was a surge in household debt, not economic strength. After the entire industry, it became dependent on the expansion of credit rather than the expansion of real income. As wages stagnated and living costs soared, automakers and financiers created a parallel economy of loans and leases that gave the appearance of demand. It was a bubble hiding beneath the shine of new cars and glossy advertisements. Behind that image lay a system suffocating under its own contradictions. You cannot sustain prosperity when the foundation of your economy is built on the inability of workers to afford what they produce. And yet, that is precisely what capitalism demands: cheap labor to create goods and high prices to extract profit. The two cannot coexist indefinitely, and their collision produces what we now call market crashes. The car industry became a microcosm of this contradiction. It required a growing market to maintain profits, but it also required cutting labor costs to satisfy shareholders. So factories closed. Jobs were outsourced and automation replaced workers, all in the name of efficiency, but those same workers were the consumers who bought the cars. As their wages fell and job security evaporated, the market that sustained the industry began to erode from within. What appeared as a market slowdown was in reality a working class implosion. The system devoured its own consumer base and when demand could no longer be conjured through debt, the bubble burst. The so-called supply chain crisis and interest rate hikes merely accelerated what was already set in motion. When credit became expensive, through the fragile web of car loans, dealer financing, and speculative investment began to unravel. Consumers defaulted, dealerships closed, and manufacturers saw profits plunge. Yet none of this should come as a surprise. The same pattern has unfolded in housing, healthcare, and education. Each turned into a commodity, each inflated by debt, and each eventually collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The car market is simply the latest casualty of a system incapable of regulating itself. Corporate leaders, of course, will claim they didn't see it coming. They'll blame market cycles, global tensions, or even consumer behavior, but behind the rhetoric lies a deeper truth. They did see it coming, and they profited from it anyway. The stock buybacks, the record executive bonuses, the massive dividends paid out even as debt mounted. These were not mistakes, they were strategies. When the collapse arrived, it didn't hit everyone equally. The losses were socialized through layoffs, bankruptcies, and government bailouts while the gains remained privatized in the hands of those who engineered the system in the first place. This is what happens when markets are treated as natural forces rather than social constructs. We are taught to see crashes as unavoidable acts of economic weather, but in reality, they are deliberate outcomes of policies that prioritize private profit over collective stability. After. The car market was not too big to fail. It was too profitable to fix. After. Every sign of weakness was ignored because acknowledging it would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that capitalism, as currently structured after, is fundamentally unstable. At its core, the collapse reflects a deeper moral and structural failure. After, when industries grow by extracting wealth rather than creating it, they hollow themselves out from the inside. The car industry's collapse is not merely a story of bad loans or market saturation. It is a story of a system that rewards short-term gain and punishes long-term thinking. The result is a cycle of artificial booms followed by devastating busts, each one transferring more power and wealth upward. The truth is that this collapse was never about cars. It was about control. The industry was a tool for channeling wealth, debt, and dependency in a way that preserved the dominance of corporations and financiers. Now that the machine has broken down, they will once again ask for rescue, demand subsidies, and insist that the public shoulder the cost of their failure. And unless we confront the structural logic that allows this cycle to repeat, we will continue watching new markets rise and fall like clockwork. The collapse of the car market, then, is not the end of an era. It is the exposure of a lie. It shows us with painful clarity that the system was never designed for sustainability, but for extraction. The crisis was not born of misfortune, but of intent. It was built into the very foundations of a system that values profit over people, consumption over care, and illusion over reality. And until that foundation is rebuilt, every new market will carry within it the seeds of its own destruction. After, the story of this car market collapse is not just about falling prices, failed loans, or corporate mismanagement. It is about a system that consistently places profit above people. For decades, the auto industry has operated as one of the clearest examples of how capitalism prioritizes accumulation over human well-being. Every decision, from design to production to sales, has been dictated not by what benefits society, but by what maximizes quarterly earnings and shareholder returns. And when that logic dominates, the outcome is predictable. People are reduced to tools for generating profit. And when they are no longer useful, they are discarded. For years, corporations told us the car represented freedom, mobility, independence, progress. But in reality, it became a mechanism for control and exploitation. The entire structure of the modern car economy, massive debt financing, planned obsolescence, an artificial scarcity, was designed to extract as much value as possible from ordinary people while giving them the illusion of ownership. Consumers didn't buy cars, they bought years of debt. The auto loan industry ballooned into a 1.5 trillion mountain of financial manipulation, trapping millions of families in repayment cycles that often exceeded the lifespan of the vehicles themselves. This was not an accident, it was a strategy. The product wasn't transportation, it was indebtedness. The corporations behind this structure understood exactly what they were doing. They saw that wages had stagnated for decades, yet rather than raise pay, they made credit more accessible. Easy financing replaced fair income as the bridge between people and the goods they needed. In this way, the working class was kept afloat not by prosperity, but by borrowing against its future. And as always, when that future came due, it was the workers who paid while the corporations cashed out and moved on. The car industry's relentless pursuit of profit reshaped not only economics, but also the environment and the human landscape. Cities were built around cars, not people. Public transportation was neglected. Communities were divided by highways. And pollution became a normalized cost of doing business. Millions of people now depend on vehicles not because they chose to, but because the system left them no alternative. And as fuel prices, maintenance costs, and insurance rise, that dependency becomes a burden, a form of quiet economic coercion. What was once sold as freedom is now a form of captivity. When the car market began to falter, corporations quickly revealed their true loyalties. They did not hesitate to lay off thousands of workers, close plants and slash wages, all while reporting billions in profits just months earlier. Executives still collected bonuses investors still received dividends, and stock buybacks continued to inflate the illusion of corporate health. The burden of adjustment was placed entirely on workers and consumers. The same people who built the cars, sold them, and financed them were told they must sacrifice to save the industry. But the industry did not belong to them. It belonged to those who profited from their labor. This pattern exposes a cruel truth about how capitalism defines value. A worker is valuable only as long as they can generate surplus for their employer. Once they become an expense, they are eliminated. It is the same logic that justifies outsourcing, automation, and wage suppression. It is not personal. It is systemic. Profit is the measure of success, not the well-being of the people who make that profit possible. And so long as that remains the measure, every crisis will result in the same outcome: the powerful insulated, the powerless abandoned. Even government responses follow this logic. When the market crashes, relief doesn't flow to the people who lose their jobs or their homes. It flows to the corporations deemed too important to fail. Bailouts are presented as necessary to protect the economy, but what they actually protect is the concentration of power. The public pays to preserve private wealth. When times are good, profits are privatized. When times are bad, losses are socialized. The working population becomes the shock absorber for a system that refuses to hold the wealthy accountable. The irony is that the people who produce real value, the workers who design, assemble, and maintain these vehicles, are treated as expendable, while those who manipulate value, the executives and financiers, are treated as essential. This inversion is not the product of mismanagement. It is the essence of the system. Profit requires someone to bear the cost, and in every crisis, that burden is carefully shifted downward. In truth, the car market's collapse reveals something much larger than an industry failure. It shows the moral bankruptcy of an economy that measures success by the size of its profits, not by the well-being of its people. It exposes how corporations can destroy communities, pollute the planet, and destabilize entire nations while still being celebrated as efficient and innovative. Efficiency in this context means the ruthless ability to extract value while minimizing responsibility. What makes this particularly tragic is that the resources, technology, and labor exist to create a system that works for everyone. The factories that once produced luxury SUVs could produce affordable electric vehicles or public transport fleets. The billions spent on advertising could fund sustainable urban planning. The skill of the workers could be redirected toward innovation that serves human need rather than corporate greed. But such transformations threaten the hierarchy of profit, and so they are dismissed as unrealistic. The collapse is not merely financial, it is ethical. It forces us to confront a question our economic system has long avoided: what should the purpose of production be? Should it be to enrich a few or to improve the lives of the many? Until we answer that question honestly and build an economy around people instead of profit, we will continue to repeat this cycle: prosperity for the few, crisis for the rest. Because when profit stands above people, collapse is not a mistake of the system, it is its design. When economic collapse arrives, the headlines always focus on markets, corporations, and investors. But the real story, the one rarely told, is what happens to the people who make those markets function: the working class. Every time capitalism trembles, It is the workers who absorb the shock, even though they had no hand in creating the crisis. The 2.8 trillion car market collapse is no different. So once again, the powerful retreat behind corporate shields, the state rushes to protect profits, and those who assemble the cars drive them after, and service them are left to pay the price for a disaster they did not cause. The working class was the backbone of the car industry. From the assembly lines of Detroit to the parts factories in Mexico and the dealerships scattered across the globe, millions of people depended on this sector for survival. Their labor generated unimaginable wealth for corporate executives, investors, and shareholders. When the market began to crumble, those same workers became expendable overnight. Plants shut down, dealerships closed, and layoffs spread like wildfire. Families who had built their lives around steady paychecks suddenly found themselves adrift, struggling to cover rent, for food and medical bills, while CEOs received bonuses for restructuring. This is the defining cruelty of capitalism's after. The people who make the system function are the first to suffer when it fails. During the boom years, workers were told to be grateful for their jobs, even as their wages stagnated and their benefits eroded. Productivity climbed, profit soared, and yet real income barely moved. Every gain was siphoned upward. And when the inevitable downturn arrived, the story flipped. Now workers were told that their pay was too high, that costs needed to be cut, that the market demanded sacrifice. The market, of course, never demands sacrifice from those at the top. We must understand this as more than a series of corporate decisions. It is a structural feature of the system itself. The economy is designed so that when profits fall, the costs are passed down to labor. The layoffs, the wage cuts, after the closure of factories, these are not unfortunate side effects. They are deliberate mechanisms to preserve profitability. In this logic, the well-being of millions is secondary to the stability of stock prices. Workers are treated as disposable inputs, easily replaced, easily forgotten. And when they protest, they are told that the economy cannot afford their demands, as if the economy were some sacred entity rather than a human creation built to serve the interests of a few. For the working class, the consequences of such collapses are devastating and long-lasting. Unemployment does not simply mean the loss of a paycheck. It means the collapse of community. It means families unable to support themselves after children pulled from schools and neighborhoods hollowed out by despair. Every shuttered plant is not just an economic failure, it is a social wound. And yet, in boardrooms and financial reports, this suffering is presented as cost optimization. It is sanitized hidden beneath the language of efficiency and progress. The cruel irony is that the workers who lose their jobs are often blamed for their own misfortune. The narrative shifts quickly. They didn't save enough, didn't adapt to new technologies, didn't work hard enough. But how can anyone adapt to a system that constantly shifts the ground beneath them? How can one save when wages are stagnant, rent is rising, and debt is the only bridge to survival? The truth is that the working class is trapped in a cycle of instability that it did not create. The system depends on their labor, but offers them no security in return. Governments step in, but not for them. Instead, massive relief funds are directed toward corporations, ensuring that investors remain protected while workers are told to wait for the recovery. The recovery, of course, never truly reaches them. When the economy rebounds, jobs return at lower wages with fewer benefits under worse conditions. The cycle resets, more profit at the top, more precarity at the bottom. The system calls this resilience, but it is really exploitation with a fresh coat of paint. Meanwhile, the psychological toll is immense. A lifetime of labor that once promised dignity and stability now leads to anxiety and uncertainty. The workers are told they must reskill, as if personal effort can overcome systemic design. After the same politicians and executives who praise hard work remain silent when that work yields only insecurity. After the myth of meritocracy crumbles under the weight of reality, no amount of individual effort can save people from a system that treats them as expendable. After the collapse of the car market is not simply an industrial failure. It is a reflection of the larger economic order that governs our lives. When crises hit, the wealthy retreat behind financial cushions while workers face foreclosure, repossession, and hunger. The system is rigged to ensure that the pain always flows downward. The same hands that built the cars now struggle to afford them. After the same people who kept the economy moving are the first to be told there is no money left. After what makes this even more tragic is that the wealth to prevent such suffering already exists. After the profits accumulated during the boom years could have been used to stabilize jobs, improve wages, and strengthen communities. But that wealth was never intended to serve the many. It was hoarded by the few. And when the bubble burst, after the same people who had enriched themselves demanded public rescue, paid for by the taxes of those now unemployed. The working class pays the price because after, in this system, they always do. They bear the cost of every crisis, every bailout, every market correction. Yet without their labor, after no recovery is possible. That is the paradox of capitalism. It exploits the very class it depends upon. Until that reality is confronted, until workers claim the right not only to their labor, but to the wealth it creates, the cycle will repeat itself. After the car market collapse is not an isolated event, after it is another chapter in the ongoing story of a system that demands sacrifice from those who can least afford it, after, while rewarding those who caused the crisis in the first place. When the economy collapses, governments like to call it an emergency. They rush to the cameras to speak of stability, of saving jobs, of protecting the system. But when you watch closely, when you look past the rhetoric, you see what those words really mean. The government does not rescue the people who lose their jobs, their homes, or their livelihoods. It rescues the rich, the banks, the corporations, after the investors, those whose power defines the system itself. The 2.8 trillion car market collapse has once again made this truth impossible to ignore. After the state, which should serve the public, has become a shield for the wealthy, absorbing their losses while leaving ordinary people to shoulder the cost. The script is familiar. When profits rise, corporations boast about their independence. After, they celebrate the free market, insisting the government stay out of their affairs. They preach about efficiency, merit, and competition. But when the market turns against them, when their own speculation and greed backfire, suddenly they cry out for help. Suddenly, after, the free market becomes unbearable, and they demand public money to save them from their own failures. And every time, the government obliges, because the same institutions that caused the crisis are the ones financing political campaigns, writing economic policy, and shaping public narratives. In the car market collapse, we saw this pattern unfold yet again. Automakers faced mounting debt, slowing demand. After an unsold inventory, they could have accepted losses, restructured their businesses, or taken responsibility for their reckless strategies. Instead, they turned to the state. They demanded subsidies, tax breaks, and interest rate relief. They argued that their collapse would harm workers, communities, and supply chains. But behind that plea for jobs was a more cynical motive protecting shareholder wealth and executive compensation. The bailout wasn't about saving the industry, it was about saving ownership. Meanwhile, after, the workers, the very people whose labor created the industry's wealth, received little more than platitudes. After governments offered them retraining programs, unemployment checks, and promises of future recovery. These gestures are temporary, symbolic. The real money flows upward. The billions in emergency funds never reach the unemployed mechanic, the laid-off factory worker, or the struggling family trying to keep their car from being repossessed. Instead, those funds are absorbed by corporations that use them to pay off debt, buy back stock, or maintain executive bonuses, all under the guise of stabilizing the market. This transfer of wealth from public to private hands is not an accident. It is the defining feature of modern capitalism. The state functions as a financial insurer for the elite, after intervening only when the system's stability and therefore the profits of the few are threatened. The public, meanwhile, is treated as collateral after. The justification is always the same, that saving corporations will eventually benefit everyone. After, we are told that a rising tide lifts all boats. But in reality, the tide is engineered to rise only for yachts, while everyone else drowns. After, the deeper truth is that government bailouts are not about preventing collapse. They are about preventing change. Each crisis reveals the failures of the system, and each bailout ensures that those failures continue. Instead of rethinking the structure of production, after ownership and labor, the state rebuilds the same broken model funded by taxpayers who never see the rewards. After, the car market collapse could have been a moment to reimagine transportation towards sustainability, public investment, and equitable mobility. But that would threaten the dominance of private capital. So instead, after, the state intervenes to preserve the illusion of stability while ensuring that ownership remains concentrated in the same hands. Consider how quickly governments can act when the rich are in danger. During a crisis, trillions of dollars can appear overnight. Interest rates are cut after, stimulus packages are announced, and emergency funds flow freely. But when ordinary people ask for affordable housing, free health care, or better schools, the same governments plead poverty. They say the money simply doesn't exist. Somehow, after, fiscal responsibility only applies when spending benefits the working class. For corporations, there are no limits. For the public, there is only austerity. After, the hypocrisy is staggering. When workers demand a living wage, they are told it will cause inflation. When executives demand a bailout, they are called too vital to fail. When citizens fall into debt, they face foreclosure. When corporations do the same, their debt is forgiven. After, this is not a government of the people. It is a government for profit. Its policies reflect the priorities of those who own capital, not those who create it. The tragedy is not only economic but moral. A government that protects wealth over welfare loses its legitimacy. It teaches its citizens that loyalty and labor count for nothing compared to power and privilege. It transforms democracy into theater, after, where elections change faces but not the system itself. The real decisions, who gets saved, who gets sacrificed, are made behind closed doors, after, by those who never face the consequences of their choices. And yet the people continue to pay. They pay through taxes that fund corporate bailouts. They pay through inflation that follows monetary rescue operations. They pay through cuts to public services. They're justified by the very debts created to save the rich. It is a silent theft, dressed in the language of responsibility. After, the working class is told to tighten its belt while billionaires loosen theirs. This is why every new crisis feels like déjà vu. After, because the same script plays out again and again. Capitalism collapses, the state intervenes, the rich are rescued, and the people are blamed. Until this dynamic changes, until governments serve the public rather than capital, the pattern will continue. The car market collapse is not an anomaly. After, it is a reflection of how deeply the state has been captured by wealth. The next bailout, after the next emergency, will follow the same path unless the public demands something different, an economy where government serves human need after, not corporate greed. Only then will rescue mean recovery for everyone, not just the rich. So what do we take from this moment? We can no longer pretend that these collapses are isolated. They are symptoms of a system designed to self-destruct after. The question is not how to save the car market, but how to build an economy that serves people, not profits. Imagine if the same factories now shutting down were repurposed to produce electric public transport, community vehicles after, or affordable infrastructure for collective mobility. Things that actually improve lives. That is what a rational democratic economy would do after. But that would require challenging the sacred cow of capitalism, the idea that private profit should determine the direction of society. Until we do that, we'll keep reliving the same cycle, boom, crash, bailout, repeat. Ladies and gentlemen, this 2.8 trillion collapse is not the end. It's the revelation. After, it shows us the truth of an economy that cannot sustain itself without exploiting those who keep it alive after. The question now is, will we allow them to rebuild the same broken system again, or will we finally demand something better? The choice, as always, after is ours, but history shows that when the people awaken, even trillion-dollar empires can crumble.